Well, good morning. We're here at the Highland Church of Christ doing the Sunday morning Bible study, and we've been using the Foundations Handbook from the Gospel Advocate, and we're going through the book of Genesis this quarter, and it is a survey. We will focus on select passages and try to do the best we can, even though we can't cover the whole book all at once. But this week we're in Genesis chapter 9. We've been chronicling the details of Noah, getting ready for the flood, getting through the flood, and now we're going to look at a few verses after the flood. You'll notice that if you've followed along in the handbook and you've done your homework, that Genesis chapter 9, we covered the first 20 verses in the assigned reading and in the homework. There's a few extra verses that are left out that can be troubling for teachers to try to get through. And so we are going to just jump straight into those, and so we can try to see what's going on in these particular texts. We do see, starting with verse 18, one of the sons of Noah, Ham, can commit some heinous crimes against his father. Oddly though, Ham is not the one cursed by his father. Instead, Ham's son Canaan bears the wrath of Noah. And I've referred to at various times a particular volume known as The Unseen Realm by Dr. Michael S. Heiser. And the main thrust of what we're going to present was originally shared by Dr. Heiser on his podcast, the Naked Bible Podcast, on episode number 159. So what Dr. Heiser presents in this episode is largely based on an article by John Seitz Bergsma and Scott Walker Hahn. The article is entitled Noah's Nakedness and the Curse on Canaan. It's from the Journal of Biblical Literature, volume 124, part 1, from 2005, pages 25 through 41. So you're welcome to look that up at any point if you want to kind of see where we're coming from with this particular material. But first, let's read the text starting in Genesis chapter 20 and verse 18. The sons of God who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine, and became drunk, and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." Anyone that's surveyed the book of Genesis a few times will have noticed this enigmatic text. And this one, quite frankly, has baffled me for a good 20 years or so. And Dr. Heiser has said that if you're not tuned in especially to idiomatic expressions in biblical Hebrew, it's very easy to misinterpret this passage. Dr. Heiser lays groundwork in the study of idiomatic language, but first let's do a brief introduction to the concept of idioms if you have never heard of this word before. Native English speakers will be familiar with such phrases as we need to get on the ball, or somebody's teaching might be considered on point. Now, if somebody 2,000 years from now is studying ancient Near Western English, they may have dictionaries or lexicographic tools. However, just as it is true for those of us who have acquired perhaps a Strong's Concordance or the Bauer, Denker, Art, and Gingrich lexicon on classical and Koine Greek, we've learned that it is one thing to look up a word in its historical context. It's another thing altogether when words are combined into phrases known as idioms that have not been readily preserved in some manual or glossary of vocabulary and definitions. So just remember, when we see idioms in the Bible, literal renderings of each Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek word does not always necessarily yield a conceptually congruent translation. We will see this is exactly the case when we read about uncovering someone's quote-unquote nakedness. First, I want to put this out there. This is the adult Bible class for our Sunday morning curriculum. For those of you that may have young children in the room, just beware. There's some really strong language in some parts of the Bible, and God felt that this particular event was important enough to record in Scripture. But you may want to press pause and make sure more sensitive audiences have their own Bible class curriculum that they can go through in the convenience of your home. Having said that, we're going to get into some very mature content. Viewer discretion is advised. Let's talk about how this passage has been approached traditionally. There are three traditional views held by various Jewish groups and Christian interpreters as well. Dr. Heiser lays out the three main views concisely. The first is the classic interpretation that he calls voyeurism, that the sin of Ham was essentially looking at Noah's naked body. The problem is the forbidden nature of the act of looking itself, that there's something taboo about looking upon nudity, and that is the nature or essence of the sin that Ham commits. He embarrasses Noah, and therefore Noah curses Canaan. Now, this has been popular since antiquity, or from some of the earliest readers of the literature. Now, this view is easy enough to digest because it takes a reading of the text literally. We appreciate that. The problem with this interpretation is that it results in Noah cursing his grandson and all of his subsequent descendants through that grandson. This does seem extremely harsh on one hand, and Dr. Heiser quotes Donald J. Would, who remarks, "Scholars who accept the literal or voyeuristic view must defend a custom about which we know nothing. This would be the only known instance of a grandfather levying a curse upon his descendants for not just an isolated act of perversion, but one that was perpetuated by the grandchild's father." Heiser continues, "You walk into a tent, and there you see your dad naked unexpectedly, and that merits the curse of the grandson Canaan? It just seems like it's overkill." And again, we don't really have any evidence that it was taboo to just come upon someone's naked body and see them, and then you were in big trouble. There's nothing like that in biblical law or ancient Near Eastern law. The second historically popular tradition emerged much later with Hebrew rabbinic tradition, those who would have taught the law in the synagogues. And I personally find it so underwhelming, I don't care to spend much time on it at all. The main thrust of it, if you're interested, is that Ham actually castrates Noah in an attempt to overrun the long-term inheritance for the oldest son of Noah and the descendants of Ham. So the only support for this theory is that at this point Noah has the three sons, and Noah basically after being castrated, he will be unable to have a fourth son, so therefore he curses the son of Ham, known as Canaan. And I respect the rabbis of old, and I'm not really mad at them. However, as we'll see, a reasonable conclusion for this text is much easier to follow, so stay tuned for that. But first, before we resolve the tension and strangeness of this text, let's briefly look at the third explanation. This one is typically the second most popular. Heiser says that the sin of Ham in the third view is paternal incest. In other words, Noah was sexually abused by Ham. There's a homosexual violation here. Gagnon, in his otherwise excellent book, The Bible and Homosexual Practice, actually takes this view. Dr. Heiser doesn't take this view, and neither do I, but we'll listen to Dr. Heiser explain why. If you go to Genesis chapter 9, verse 24, you read a phrase to the effect that Noah saw what his son had done to him. That suggests, and I would agree at this point, that we have some kind of crime committed here that goes well beyond just accidentally seeing nakedness. In other words, it goes well beyond voyeurism. Proponents of this will say, look, something was done to Noah here. It's not just seeing the nakedness. One would ask, what could be done to Noah that would be so bad, and then eventually that we result in some kind of sexual violation. The phrase that describes what Ham does or did, quote unquote, he saw the nakedness of his father, is what Heiser refers to as an idiomatic expression of sexual intercourse. And we'll talk about what that means and how we know that that's the case in this moment. So let's stick with what this view says. It argues that since we know that this idiom of uncovering nakedness has to do with sexually explicit activity, once we put it together, that this is a paternal incest or sexual activity perpetuated against Ham's father Noah. Now, this view gets the idiom somewhat correct, but then misapplies it. If we go with the homosexual violation here, it doesn't explain why Canaan is the one who is cursed. Most people who have casually read this passage come to the conclusion that it's actually Ham who's cursed and not his grandson Noah. Well, read the passage again carefully. We'll see that Noah knows who did what, but he doesn't curse Ham. He curses Canaan. Ham, in fact, is never cursed in this particular passage. So let's just start with the idea of the Hebrew idiom in this phrase, see the nakedness of his father. It could be difficult to interpret if we have no other passages in the Old Testament to kind of give us some contextual clues or ideas about what it's meaning, but that's not the case at all. In fact, we'll see that there is an abundance of textual material that helps us connect the dots. What we have in Genesis 9 is indeed a Hebrew idiom. To see is the Hebrew verb ra'ah. The nakedness is the Hebrew word erwah. Of someone, and putting the two together is what creates the idiom. It's an expression for sexual intercourse. And how do we know that? Well, first, if you'd like to turn to Leviticus chapter 20, verse 17, we read that if a man takes his sister, a daughter of his father, or a daughter of his mother, and sees her nakedness, and she sees his nakedness, it is a disgrace, and they shall be cut off in the sight of the children of their people. He has uncovered his sister's nakedness, and he shall bear his iniquity. The key here is to understand that uncovering nakedness, which describes the act of removing clothing from the genital region for the purpose of sex, and quote-unquote seeing nakedness, are equated in this passage. Did you notice that? We have the idiom to see the nakedness of, and quote, sees her nakedness, and that's parallel to quote, uncovering nakedness. Similar expression, but with two different verbs, see and uncover. That's important because if you actually search for the phrase uncovering nakedness, there the Hebrew word is galah. You're going to find passages that very clearly and explicitly show that uncovering nakedness is a reference to sexual intercourse. And once you discern that, then you go back to Leviticus chapter 20, verse 17 and say, aha, uncovering nakedness is to have sex. And that's in parallel with seeing nakedness. So that must also mean to have sexual relations. So this is what we're dealing with. Let's just back up a little bit. Listen to the uncovering nakedness terminology in Leviticus chapter 18. This section of Leviticus, in which we have essentially a holiness code on sexual morality or immorality. Let's start in verse 6. None of you shall approach any of his close relatives to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's daughter, whether brought up in the family or in another home. In verse 10, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your son's daughter or of your daughter's daughter, for their nakedness is your own nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife's daughter, brought up in your father's family, since she is your sister. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister. She is your father's relative. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, for she is your mother's relative. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. That is, you shall not approach his wife. She is your aunt. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It is your brother's nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of a woman and of her daughter, and you shall not take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness. They are relatives. It is depravity. And you shall not take a woman as a rival wife to her sister, uncovering her nakedness while her sister is alive. This idiomatic expression, to uncover nakedness, also occurs in Ezekiel chapter 16, which is also a very sexually explicit passage, which we'll skip for time's sake, but jot it down and read through it for more information. The context of Ezekiel chapter 16 is very sexual in orientation, and so is Ezekiel chapter 22, especially verse 10, as it contains the same idea, and that he's speaking to the city here in a reference to sexual intercourse with people you shouldn't be having sex with. Also, Ezekiel chapter 23, the next chapter, it's talking about Jerusalem and Judah's relationship with the Assyrians. Again, it's very clear it's sexual in context. And if you go down to verse 18 and through verse 29, again, the sexual content is very clear. And they shall deal with you in hatred, and take away all the fruit of your labor, and leave you naked and bare, and the nakedness of your whoring shall be uncovered. The context is pretty clear. Now, it should go without saying that the Bible having injunctions about exposing nakedness shouldn't need to be taught, whether you're talking about people within your immediate family or anyone else for that matter. There have been laws in all of the societies pretty much where you just don't go uncovering people's nakedness. But if we look at it with the concept of the idiom in mind, what it's actually teaching is a prohibition against incest. It focuses on those of a family relationship because historically there are different laws, cultures, and customs that make different nations, tribes, and places similar and different. But throughout the history of moral codes, laws, and ethics, the most universal taboo, I realize there are a few exceptions in few places of the world, but going back to these passages in Leviticus especially, incest is considered the most taboo sort of sin across cultures, countries, and customs. And so this is what it looks like when the biblical authors wanted to make sure that in consistent keeping with sexual purity codes, incest is clearly marked by very explicit and graphic boundaries. We said all of that to show that when this phrase of uncovering nakedness is used over and over and over again with forbidden sexual relationships, it is this idiomatic expression to have sex with. Since that phrase or idiom is used in parallel passages like Leviticus chapter 20 verse 17 to see nakedness, scholars, and Dr. Heiser agrees and so would I, would say that both of the idiomatic expressions say the same thing, whether it's uncovering nakedness or to see nakedness. They are both references to quote-unquote having sex with that person. To this point, this is the argument of the paternal incest view. That is the homosexual violation of Noah by by Ham as the third option. And since we know that see the nakedness of is a euphemism for having sex, the argument goes that Ham is having sex with his father Noah. Now, this paternal incest doesn't hold up under close scrutiny. It misses something in Leviticus chapter 18. You're going to see what we're tracking on here. We don't have homosexual intercourse here. We have heterosexual intercourse going on, especially Leviticus chapter 18 verse 6, where it says, "None of you shall approach any of his close relatives to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness." Now, in the Old Testament and Semitic patriarchal culture, the nakedness of a man was defined as the woman that belonged to him. That's why Leviticus uses this wording. To us, it sounds very confusing, but if you understand the idiom, suddenly it makes perfect sense. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. So don't uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. Well, why? Why shouldn't I uncover the nakedness of my father's wife? Because it's your father's nakedness. Moses makes that point in Leviticus over and over and over. And to this point, I'd like to interject that when taking this in with respect to what we've already read, like in Genesis chapter 1, where Adam knew his wife Eve, and he declares that for this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother to cleave to his wife, they shall become, quote unquote, one flesh. So it makes sense that if you uncover the nakedness of your father's wife, your mother, you're also uncovering his nakedness as well. It has some profound spiritual dynamic implications to what we're talking about. So Dr. Heiser made the following point. It's very clear to see nakedness and to uncover nakedness as idioms for sexual intercourse. But then people will take that and go back to Genesis 9 and say, look, this means to have sex with, and that's what Ham does to Noah. But if you look at Genesis 22, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father. Again, the voyeurists say he's just looking at Noah's naked body. The paternal incest view will say, look, he saw the nakedness of his father, which meant he had sexual relations with his father. No. What it actually means is, if you go back to Leviticus, you see that your father or any particular man like your brother is to take a man or woman's wife sexually. What we have in Genesis 9 is not paternal incest. What we have in Genesis 9 is maternal incest. This idiom, to see nakedness or uncover nakedness, is never used in the Bible in the various injunctions regarding homosexuality. It's not an idiom that's used for homosexual violation or intercourse. There you have terms like shechab, which is translated to lie with another man. This idiom, to uncover a man's nakedness, is saying, do not have sex with the woman who belongs to the man. So again, if you don't know that or see that, then you're going to get a homosexual violation in Genesis 9, where what you should be seeing is maternal incest. Ham had sex with Noah's wife or his mother. That's the problem. That's the crime. So now let's think about this narrative with this information loaded into our thoughts. Shem and Japheth walk by. Ham comes across them and says, hey, guess what I just did? I had sex with mom, or our father's wife, in the event that she might have been a stepmother. But note, this is not the only time we see a case of incest in a post-apocalyptic event. Consider the narrative of Lot and his drunkenness with his daughters, for they could not find a man to procreate with. Noah is, of course, the patriarchal head of the family, and we're going to talk about the meaning of what Ham does. But he goes out and tells his brothers, right? Well, what do the brothers do? Well, they walk backwards, and they cover their father's nakedness, which I'm suggesting by virtue of this idiom means that they are actually going in and covering up their mother. They go in, they refuse to look at her, they come through the tent backwards, and they cover her. And why do they do it this way? Why do they do it that way instead of how you would normally walk in? Well, they're telegraphing a very commendable gesture. Noah is incapacitated. Ham shows up, violates his mother, and that's where the maternal incest kicks in. That's the crime. And so now we ask, how does that explain the cursing of Canaan? Well, it actually does. The maternal incest view is the only one that actually gives us a coherent explanation for the cursing of Canaan instead of Ham. Well, you say, how? Well, it goes this way. Canaan was the product of an incestuous union. The passage tells us twice, proleptically telegraphing at the very beginning of the passage in verse 18, and then again in verse 22. By cursing Canaan, Noah's telegraphed to everyone that Canaan would not become the inheritor of family leadership. Canaan is going to be excluded from birth as an illegitimate heir, and the result of Ham's attempt to usurp this position of authority and posterity as a leader of the family. Noah is angry because Ham, to use biblical or King James language, was raising up competitive seed through his father's wife with the intent of taking control of the family and then passing it on to his illegitimate son Canaan. There is strong scriptural basis for this concept. Reuben did this with Bilhah in Genesis 35 verse 22 and Genesis 49 verse 3 and 4. But the even better examples are when you get to the monarchy or the kings of Israel. There you have a real issue with succession. For instance, in 2 Samuel chapter 12 verse 8, we have an account where David, to legitimize his position, takes Saul's wives and concubines. So you'll recall that right after the Bathsheba incident, going into 2 Samuel chapter 12 verse 7, where Nathan is scolding David, he gives him a little parable about the ewe lamb, and Nathan says to David, "You are the man," in other words, you are the person in this parable who is guilty. "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul, and I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if this were too little, I would add to you as much more." He's giving it to David here. God is saying through the prophet, I made you king. This was just part of the culture. This is how you solidify a dynasty. You have sexual relations with the competitors' wives and concubines. It's just what you did. This was done to David later on by his son Absalom. There's an infamous scene to consider where Absalom says to Ahithophel, "Give your counsel. What shall we do?" And Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Go into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house, and all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench to your father, and the hands of all who were with you will be strengthened." So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Again, he does this because he's usurping David as king. He's usurping David's office. Later, in 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2, David has this almost happen to him again. Remember when David was old, they gave him a concubine named Abishag to keep him warm because he was old? Well, this warm idiom has to do with her sleeping with the king. When David is about to die and there's a question of succession, some, of course, have engineered the circumstances where Solomon would become the next king. But Adonijah, another son, had a serious backing in 1 Kings chapter 1. In verses 13 through 25, Adonijah tries to take David's concubine sexually. Again, this is what you do to solidify the dynastic tradition. This is part of Israelite culture and a part of patriarchal culture even before that. This is something that when we read Genesis 9, Ham, by doing this, is laying claim to the leadership of the family. In this view, he is going to have this particular son, Canaan, take over. And Noah says, forget it. I'm going to exclude Canaan. He is going to be a servant to all of his brothers. So he is cursed. Now let's pause for a second. because we know, and we've talked about this in previous lessons, Brandon brought it up, there has been questions since colonial times, the expansion and exploration of the Americas by European settlers and traders, when the slave workforce was extracted from the continent of Africa. This was one of those passages that was used, especially because Noah doesn't curse Ham. Rather, he curses Canaan. And he says how he is going to serve his brothers. Well, let's take that in its actual biblical context. This is going to really boil down to the offspring of Shem, who are going to end up going into the land of Canaan, which has been possessed and occupied by the descendants of Canaan. This does not have any way, it's poor biblical interpretation, translation, and hermeneutics to infer from this text that skin pigment or racial divisions or utilization for compulsory slavery had any kind of scriptural foundation in this particular text. What we see is how it plays out through the book of Joshua and Judges especially. This is a second-handed punishment of Ham, but it's really a devastating one because Canaan is going to outlive Ham. That's why Canaan becomes the target, because he is an illegitimate heir, an offspring from Noah's wife. Now, there are a few reasons why Dr. Heiser and I agree that to prefer the matriarchal incestuous interpretation of Genesis 9, verse 22 and following. I don't see any of the other three views making nearly as much sense as this one. You feel free to disagree with me, but at least now you have an idea of the concepts and parallel passages that you're attempting to disagree with. Now, the motif that I see unfolding at this point is similar to Jacob stealing the birthright of his brother Esau through treacherous means. The book of Genesis is very much loaded with the concept of power struggle, from the offspring of the serpent taking on the offspring of Eve, which we read about in Genesis chapter 3, to Cain versus Abel in Genesis 4, now to the descendants of Noah with the offspring of Shem versus the offspring of Canaan, which will become the major thrust of the conquest and settlement narratives to come. At this time, I'd like to send a special shout out to one of my college roommates, Jeremy Marshall, who is just a phenomenal scholar and preacher in his own right. And he was the one that kind of got me really interested in this particular passage long before I knew that I would end up teaching it one day, and which ended up leading me to articles and podcasts that I've alluded to in this lesson. But a key concept that he reminded me of is the reversal of power from a child to the parents that appears throughout the book of Genesis. See, for instance, Jacob's son Reuben slept with one of Jacob's concubines in Genesis 35, verse 22. We've already mentioned Absalom, who went on to rape all 10 of David's concubines during his coup in 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 21 and 22, because this was what would-be rulers did to their oppositions. And frankly, this still happens in several different parts of the world today. It's not just that Genesis 9 happened. It's that in some parts of the world, it still happens. And my brother Jeremy reminded me how Noah himself recapitulates the fall in Genesis 3. By recapitulates, I simply mean he's living out some of the things we've already seen. And this happens throughout Genesis over and over. This family makes the same kind of choices and decisions over and over and over. Watch this. Like Adam, Noah tends a garden. Like Adam, Noah makes illicit use of the fruit that it produces, which results in his drunken stupor, which creates the opportunity for Ham to seize Noah's wife. And like Adam, Noah's nakedness is exposed. And so Cain is to Adam what Ham is to Noah. And so think about that. Just as the ground is cursed by Adam's sin, Canaan is cursed because of Ham's sin. And if you look at the table of nations in Genesis chapter 10, Most of Israel's eventual enemies, Egypt, Canaan, Assyria, Babylon, they all descend from Canaan, which is no different than the curse rendered upon the serpent of Genesis 3:15. The curse going to the serpent's offspring is going to take us all the way up to the crucifixion of Jesus and opposition that has been attempting to thwart the efforts of the church ever since. All these enemies of Israel point to a larger spiritual truth. They were enslaved by Egypt to show that we are in bondage to sin and we cannot set ourselves free. They're exiled to Assyria and Babylon, and it tells us that the same foreshadowing points even to the eternal place of the wicked, hell itself. Also, the fact that the Israelites are neither able nor willing to drive out the Canaanites when their time for conquest and settlement come. It's a typological sign of how the human cannot simply rid oneself of sin without divine intervention. Big picture, this is pointing us ultimately to the work fulfilled by Jesus. So even though people for thousands of years never quite see this coming, everything that we've read preparing us for this time is an advent of God into this fallen, broken world where treachery and evil take place. And that is why we all, 2,000 years after the cross, still need Jesus so very much. Well, there's a lot more we'd like to say about that, but unfortunately, the time has come and I must depart. But thank you for joining us. I hope that this was helpful. Grace and peace be with you. In the name of Jesus our Lord. Amen.
Hey, thank you so much for watching our videos and content. If you want more videos, more content, and want to know more about us, visit our website or subscribe to us on YouTube and like us on Facebook. We'll see you next time.